The bar in the Seitz's Tavern is original. It's walnut, it's large, it's long, and it's gorgeous. So even if you're a teetotaler, you've got to go in there and put your foot on that rail and look and admire that bar.
And the tables are still the same.
They're still the same, the floor is the same. It's largely original. That whole block was built to replace a block that burned to the ground in one of the several fires that shaped Chelsea. And all the buildings along that block on Main Street and turning the corner and going down to Seitz's were built at about the same time. Around 1940, Seitz's Tavern was updated on the front. There are porcelainized panels. That was a fairly common fad in those days, and I call it fad, I don't mean that pejoratively, but it was a way to give a new look to an old building. And so those are very typical of what would have been done to an old building 75 years ago to modernize it. If you're restoring an old building, the National Park Service has 10 guides for restoration. Number 4 says that changes that have occurred to a building during its history are in fact a part of its history and should be considered for preservation. So it's perfectly proper for a dyed-in-the-wool preservationist to say we've got to save those porcelain panels on the front of that building. They are typical 1940.
Are you familiar with the term growler? You know how that originated? Well, the growler is nothing more than a little bucket, and story has it that the women and or children of that particular time period, rather than having their husband in the saloon, as John would have been, take the growler around noon, take it to the back door and make a lot of noise until the barkeep comes out, fills their bucket, and they take it home.
The neon sign on that is original and typical, original from the period that neon came. When it was originally built, of course, I'm sure it had a painted wood sign, but when neon came along, that and the Harper's Pontiac sign next to it are very typical, 3/4 of a century old original neon signs.
Let's move right next door and talk about the town hall.
People wonder why the bell tower was on it. I think the most likely explanation is that called the fire department when there was a fire, which there often were. And it's not the original bell that was in it. The bell's been changed out about 3 different times. But that has served over the years in a number of different ways. Wirt McLaren, the only daughter of the McLarens that owned this house, the banker, for 30 years, used that to show movies theaters in. Back in the day, of early days of movies. He wanted to be in competition with the Princess, was at the theater down on Main Street.
And it's not been that long that building was actually renovated, because I remember when we first moved here, we voted there.
Yes, well, the village council held their meetings there, and it served as the village offices for quite some time. And it's had various retail in there. There was a stage in there for,
I remember the
for
stage.
A live theater. They sometimes had various live entertainment in those pre-television, pre-radio days. You had traveling troops that would come around, and there's nothing else to do in town in the evening. We're going to go down to the entertainment, and so it was an entertainment center, among other things. If you look, it's got very interesting architecture. There are some corbelled brick details over the main entrance. They're repeated on the window over on the second floor, and they're repeated again right up under the bell tower, each time getting smaller. And it cost a few pennies to do that. It took time, but fortunately, the builders in those days were sensitive to the appearance of their buildings.
But Chelsea was always a prosperous town, again, going back to the railroad time. And as you say, woolens and beans and all that sort of vegetables and things were in high demand.
Some of the farmers that lived in town owned quite a few hundred acres, so they weren't necessarily subsistence farmers out scratching in the dirt. In fact, this was called the Vermont Colony for a while, because so many fairly well-to-do farmers that had been in a certain area in Vermont moved out here, including the Congdons. And they named this place Chelsea after Chelsea, Massachusetts, which they liked the name, which in turn was named after that little town near London.
And I can't help but think, with the old Chelsea lumber that was downtown there. Bob Daniels said in one of his talks that they used the railroad highly to get their lumber, brought in,
I guess that we were fortunate in a lot of ways in that there was enough money here to hire architects. In fact, an awful lot of the architecture around here was due to one self-trained architect named Claire Allen. We haven't mentioned him. He lived in Jackson, but he became Frank Glazier's architect of choice. And he designed a lot of things for Glazier. The current Glazier complex was built. That was all designed by Claire Allen. He copied something called the Kahn system in 1904. Alfred Kahn, internationally well-known architect in Detroit, built a new Packard automobile factory.
Right.
And to make it fireproof, there were steel structure. Steel had been invented then. They weren't necessarily iron columns. There were steel columns in there. And steel columns, if there's a great big fire that blazes long enough, they soften and the building crumbles. He put forms around these steel columns and filled them full of grout to insulate them from the heat. It's called the Kahn system.
The Fisher building is like that, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, Claire Allen says, gee, that's just exactly what we need for this stoveworks, which has a history of catching fire from time to time. So those new buildings, the big warehouse that the clock tower is on, were all built with that Kahn system.
And with the 5,000-gallon oaken barrel in the clock tower, which was added later, they had a gravity-fed sprinkler system in the buildings.
They did, and they eventually enlarged that reservoir up there to something like 30,000 gallons.
Right,
It's huge.
right.
I was up there years ago. You could climb up there.
That'd be pretty scary.
So here he's got all this water under pressure, sprinklers everywhere, and the building is fireproof anyway. So they went all the way. But he hired Allen to build his bank building on Main Street. It's now the courthouse, but it was eventually the Chelsea State Bank. Glazier built that in 1901, right after the death of his father, George. Allen was a very talented architect who didn't have a style of his own, but could copy or use a lot of styles that were popular. And Glazier says, I want a monumental style for this bank. I want Beaux-Art. I want neoclassical. When you put your money in my bank, it's safe because look at the monumental permanence of this structure. So it is a gorgeous, elaborate structure that a little town like this you wouldn't normally have, but Glazier wanted a monumental bank building in memory of his father, and Claire Allen designed that building just that way.